Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Don't forget to hit that like button if you're enjoying these deep dives into fascinating topics. And subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, the whole 9 yards so you never miss an episode. Today, we're diving into a topic that's super important for anyone interested in Indian history. The British East India Company, Acts and Regulations. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Acts and regulations. Sounds a bit dry, right? But trust me, this is actually a really fascinating story. It's a story of power ambition and how a trading company ended up ruling a subcontinent. We'll uncover how what seems like boring paperwork actually reshaped India, setting the stage for everything that came after. And for those of you studying for the UPSC exam, especially the GS1 Modern Indian History section, this deep dive is going to be super helpful. We'll break down all the key acts and regulations in a way that's both insightful and memorable. You'll be able to impress even the toughest examiner with your knowledge.
What's really interesting about this topic is that we're not just talking about historical events. Understanding these acts and regulations actually gives you a framework for understanding how power dynamics work even today. How do governments and corporations influence each other? How do economic interests shape political decisions? It all started, in a way, right here.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock a bit. Picture this. The 1700s. The East India Company arrives in India, eager to trade spices and, all those exotic goods. But somewhere along the way, things take a dramatic turn. They went from merchants to rulers. How did that even happen?
That's the big question, isn't it? The transition from a trading company to a governing power wasn't a sudden leap. It was more of a gradual process. Historians still debate when exactly company rule really began.
Oh, I see. So it's like trying to pinpoint the exact moment a seed becomes a sapling. It's all part of a continuous process, really.
Precisely. Some argue that 1757, after the Battle of Plassey, was the real turning point. The company basically chose the next Nawab of Bengal, giving them a lot of political influence. Others point to 1765. That's when the company got the Diwani rights, the right to collect taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Imagine the power that comes from controlling the purse strings.
Yeah, that's a lot of power.
And then there's 1773, when the company basically abolished local rule in Bengal and established their direct administration from Calcutta.
Wow, so they were making a fortune, influencing rulers, and eventually even taking over direct administration. You can almost hear the alarm bells going off in London at this point.
Exactly. You see, the company's success was also kind of its undoing. They were making so much money that it attracted a lot of, unwanted attention. Other British merchants were pretty jealous, let's be honest, and they weren't afraid to complain to Parliament about it.
Right, everyone wants a piece of the action.
Then you had some very influential thinkers at the time, like Adam Smith, who were super critical of the company's monopoly. Smith argued that free trade would benefit everyone, not just, this one powerful entity.
Ah, the classic free market argument. But on top of all that, wasn't the company also known for, not being the best with their finances?
Oh, absolutely. They were living large, expanding aggressively, and eventually it all kind of came crashing down. They had to go to the British government, hat in hand, and ask for a loan, which turned out to be a pretty big turning point.
Oh, I bet. So the company's financial woes, combined with all this external pressure, basically forced the British government to step in and impose some order. They couldn't just let this, giant company collapse. It was too important to the British economy.
Exactly.
And this is where our story of acts and regulations really begins, right? It's a story of the British government trying to, control this beast they had inadvertently created.
That's a great way to put it.
So the stage is set. We have a powerful but financially shaky company with its fingers in all sorts of pies, and a British government that's finally realizing it needs to, rein them in. This brings us to the first major attempt at control, the Regulating Act of 1773. The name suggests it was all about bringing order, but did it really live up to its name?
Well, it was a good attempt, for sure, but the Regulating Act is kind of a classic example of too little, too late.
So it's like trying to put a Band-Aid on a gaping wound.
You could say that. The act introduced some significant changes, don't get me wrong, but it just didn't have the power to really control the company in the way it needed to.
Okay, so what kind of changes did it introduce?
Well, for instance, it created the position of Governor General of Bengal, sort of like a super governor with more authority. It also established a Supreme Court in Calcutta, aiming to introduce a more formal legal system.
Those seem like pretty big steps. What was the problem then?
The issue was in the details. The act also created a council to advise the Governor General, but this council could actually outvote him. Can you imagine trying to govern a territory like Bengal when you're constantly at odds with your own advisors?
That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It certainly was. And the Act's attempts to regulate the company's financial dealings were also pretty weak, to be honest. So while it was a step in the right direction, it just didn't quite solve the problem, which is why just a few years later, Parliament had to try again with Pitt's India Act of 1784.
Pitt's India Act. Now, this sounds like the British government really flexing its muscles.
Exactly. This act was a game changer. It established the Board of Control back in London, giving the British government direct oversight of the company's affairs. No more relying on the company to regulate itself. Now the government had a direct line of control.
So it's like having a parent finally step in and say, all right, kids, playtime's over. I'm taking charge now.
That's a great analogy. And this act also solidified the Governor General's authority, reducing the power of that pesky council that had been causing so much trouble. It was clear that the company was now a tool of British national interest.
It's not just about trade anymore. It's about expanding the empire. And with Pitt's India Act, we see the beginning of a whole new era of British control in India. But that, of course, is a story for part 2 of our deep dive.
Stay tuned, because things are about to get even more interesting.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the British East India Company Acts and Regulations. In part 1, we saw how the company went from those eager spice traders to this powerful force, eventually attracting the attention and the control of the British government. We left off with Pitt's India Act of 1784, which really felt like a turning point in the story.
Yeah, that's right. From this point on, it's just this steady march towards greater and greater British control. It ends up shaping the very fabric of Indian society, the economy, governance, all of it. And it's all done through these acts and regulations, these seemingly, dry pieces of legislation that had such a huge impact on millions of lives.
It's kind of wild to think about, really. So for our listeners, especially those prepping for the UPSC, this is where things get really relevant. We're not just talking about abstract historical events anymore. We're talking about the roots of modern India's administrative systems. The seeds are being sown right here.
Absolutely. Think of it like building a house, right? These acts are the foundation, the framework upon which everything else is built. And to understand the India of today, you really need to understand these foundations.
Okay, so let's get into it. Pitt's India Act was a big step towards control. But the story doesn't end there. What happens next?
Well, Parliament realized that they needed to keep refining the system, keep tightening the screws, so to speak. So over the next few decades, we see this series of charter acts, 1793, 1813, 1833, and 1853, each one chipping away at the company's power and strengthening the grip of the crown.
So it's like a sculptor chipping away at a block of marble, slowly revealing the final form.
Yeah.
And what does that final form look like? What's the end goal here?
The end goal is essentially complete British control over India. The company is slowly transformed from this kind of semi-independent entity into basically a tool of the British government.
I see, a tool for their own purposes.
Yeah.
And these charter acts, they each bring their own set of changes, right? What are some of the key things we see happening during this period?
One of the most significant is the gradual erosion of the company's trade monopoly. They were forced to open up the Indian market to other British merchants, little by little.
So those jealous merchants we talked about earlier, they finally get their piece of the pie.
Exactly. But there's a catch, of course. The company held on really tight to its most prized possession, the tea trade with China. That remained a monopoly for a while longer.
So it's like saying, okay, you can share the sandbox, but I'm keeping this one shiny toy all to myself.
Precisely. But even that wouldn't last forever. The Charter Acts also saw a major shift in, financial responsibility. Remember how the company had to go begging for that loan?
Oh, yeah. That was not a good look.
Well, they never really recovered from that.
So what happened? Did the British government just write off the debt?
Not quite. They basically shifted the burden onto the government of India. In other words, Indian taxpayers ended up footing the bill for the company's financial problem.
Wow. That's quite a move. It's not just about control anymore. It's about extracting wealth from India to prop up the British economy.
You got it. And this financial burden, along with other policies that favored British industries, it really had a devastating impact on the Indian economy. We'll talk more about that in a bit.
We should definitely dig into that more. But first, let's get back to those administrative changes. You mentioned earlier that these acts lay the foundation for modern India's governance. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, take the position of Governor General, for example. With each act, his power just kept growing until he became the Governor General of India. overseeing this vast and complex territory. The presidencies of Bombay and Madras, which had operated somewhat independently before, they were brought under tighter control from Calcutta.
So it's centralization on a massive scale, creating this unified administrative structure across this huge, huge subcontinent.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about consolidating power, it was also about creating a more efficient and more predictable system of governance. The Charter Acts also saw the codification of laws, basically an attempt to bring some uniformity to the legal landscape. And get this, they also introduced those infamous competitive exams for civil services, laying the groundwork for a more professionalized bureaucracy.
Hold on. Are you telling me that the Indian Civil Services exams, those grueling tests that everyone dreads, they have their roots in British colonialism?
They do. The British wanted to create a meritocratic system, at least in theory, to make sure that the best and the brightest were running the administration. Of course, this system also served their purpose. It created a class of Indians who were loyal to the crown.
It's amazing how these acts have such long-reaching consequences. We're talking about changes that are still felt in India today.
Absolutely. And it's not just about administrative structures, it's about the whole fabric of Indian society. The Charter Acts had a huge impact on the economy, social structures, even the cultural landscape.
So for our UPSC folks out there, this is where you really need to start connecting the dots. How did these acts shape the India we know today? What were the intended consequences, and what were the unintended ones?
That's the big question, and it's one we'll explore in more depth in part 3 of our deep dive.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Over the past 2 parts, we've been on this journey through the world of the British East India Company, watching as they transformed from those spice traders to a, well, dominant force in India. And we've been unpacking how the British government, through all these acts and regulations, gradually tightened its control, shaping, really, the whole administrative and economic landscape of the subcontinent.
Yeah, we've covered a lot, but now it's time to kind of shift gears a bit and really analyze the long-term impact of this whole period. What does all this history mean for us today? How did these acts and regulations leave their mark on the India we know now?
Exactly. And for those of you listening who are preparing for the UPSC, this is where you can really shine. The examiners aren't just looking for you to memorize dates and events, right? They want to see that you understand the deeper significance, the lasting legacy of this period.
Right, they want to see the bigger picture.
So let's put on our thinking caps and really delve into the complexities of this historical era. Okay, so where do we even begin? What are some of the key takeaways that our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, first and foremost, I think this whole era highlights this really intricate dance between power, economics, and ideology. It wasn't just about brute force, The British really utilized legislation, cleverly crafted economic policies, even cultural influence to solidify their control over India.
It's almost like a masterclass in how to build an empire, in a way. It wasn't just about military might. It was about creating this whole system that was profitable.
Yeah.
And, at least in their minds, justifiable.
Exactly. They had convinced themselves as much as anyone else that their rule was legitimate, that they were bringing civilization and progress to India. And this ideology is really reflected in a lot of the acts and regulations we've talked about.
But alongside those justifications, there's also this, stark reality of economic exploitation, right? We talked about how Indian taxpayers were saddled with the company's debts and how British industries were given preferential treatment.
Oh, absolutely. And this economic drain had a huge impact on India's own industries. Local artisans and traditional crafts were often undercut by cheaper, mass-produced goods coming from Britain. The Indian economy was being reshaped, essentially, to serve the needs of the British Empire, not the needs of its own people.
So in a way, while the British might have claimed to be bringing progress to India, for many Indians, this progress felt a lot like exploitation.
Exactly, and that's important to remember. And the sense of injustice of being ruled by an alien power that was exploiting their land and resources, well, it eventually fueled the Indian independence movement. The seeds of resistance were sown right here in this period of British control.
Which brings up, I think, a really fascinating question. We've seen how these acts and regulations led to both positive and negative outcomes. On the one hand, they laid the foundation for a lot of the administrative systems that India still has today, like the civil services, the codified legal system. But on the other hand, they also contributed to economic exploitation and sowed the seeds of discontent that ultimately led to British rule being overthrown. So how do we reconcile these two sides of the coin? How do we really assess the legacy of this period?
That's a question that historians and scholars are still grappling with. It's really nuanced, very complex. There's no simple answer.
So what are some of the things we should be thinking about when we're trying to understand this legacy?
Well, I think it's important to remember that history isn't just about events, it's about perspectives. How did different groups of Indians experience this period? How did their lives change? What were their aspirations?
So it's about going beyond the big picture, trying to understand the human stories behind these events.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also about recognizing that the legacy of this period is still being debated and contested today. For instance, some people might argue that the British brought some positive changes, like the introduction of modern education, infrastructure development, but others might point out that these changes were often implemented to serve British interests, and they came at a huge cost to India.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just a collection of facts. It's an ongoing conversation, a way of understanding ourselves and the world around
It
us.
really is. And for our UPSC listeners out there, this is a key point to remember. The examiners aren't just looking for textbook answers. They're looking for critical thinking, the ability to analyze and evaluate different perspectives. They want to see that you understand the complexities of history, that you're not afraid to grapple with the difficult questions.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the British East India Company Acts and Regulations, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder. We've seen how a trading company became an empire, how regulations paved the way for control, and how the seeds of both modern India and its independence movement were sown in this period. But here's the question. What aspects of this really complex legacy do you think are most relevant to India today?
That's a fantastic question, and one that I think deserves a lot of thought. On that note, I think we've come to the end of our exploration. We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little inspiring.
Absolutely. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you never miss an episode. And for all our listeners out there, remember, stay curious, keep questioning, and never stop learning.